It is a curious thing, to be recruited into an act of professional treason between the second and third movements of a waltz. Curiouser still, to realise the man who brought you to the ball already knew it was coming, and said not one word. I do wish people would warn me before making me complicit in things.
I have kept a great many silences in the course of my career. Most of them I could justify to myself well enough at the time. This was not one of those.
The Yard's Festive Board is held once a year, in a hall too handsome for the men who fill it, and it is, on the whole, the one evening on which a detective inspector may be observed enjoying himself without anyone writing it down in a file. Flynn had asked me a fortnight prior, with the particular stiffness of a man who has rehearsed the sentence more than the occasion warranted.
The Commissioner has asked that I bring a partner to the board this year. I thought, that is, it occurred to me, you might not object to an evening that did not involve anyone being murdered.
Flynn, was that an invitation or a professional request?
Does it need to be one or the other?
I had not had an answer for that, which was itself answer enough. And so here I was, in blue satin I had not worn since a case in Brighton, on the arm of a man who could not decide which evening he was having. We had not been in the hall a quarter hour when the Commissioner found us. Sir Aldous Grantham cuts an impressive figure at a distance, and a rather more careful one up close. The sort of man who has learned exactly how much charm a room requires, and dispenses precisely that much, no more.
Miss West, I wonder if you would do an old man the honour.
He did not wait for Flynn to object, which I noted, and Flynn did not attempt to, which I noted rather more. He danced correctly, which is to say without any particular warmth, and waited until we had turned twice about the floor before he spoke again, low enough that it did not carry past my ear.
I am told you are the most discreet woman in London, Miss West. I am about to test the claim rather severely.
You may test it as severely as you like, Sir Aldous. I have yet to fail it.
There is a fraud operating in this city large enough to have paid for the silence of at least one man inside my own criminal investigation department, possibly more than one. I cannot use my own officers to investigate my own officers. Word travels in a building like the Yard faster than any telegram, and I cannot use an outsider who might be recognized for what she is.
And yet you are asking the one woman in London every criminal in it already knows by name.
I am asking the one woman in London clever enough to stop being recognized as herself when the situation calls for it. There is a difference, Miss West, and I rather think you know it.
I did know it. That did not make the request any less audacious nor the manner of its asking. Mid-waltz, under an orchestra, at a dinner I had been brought to by a man who was, at that very moment, watching us from the edge of the floor with an expression he plainly believed was unreadable. You might have written to my office, Sir Aldous, like anyone else with a case.
I might have. But a letter can be read by the wrong eyes, and a dance cannot.
The music ended. He returned me to the table with perfect courtesy, and this was the part I did not forgive quickly. He leaned in as he did so and said, entirely for Flynn's benefit,
I shall want a further word with you both, Inspector. Quietly. Next week, I think.
Flynn did not ask what the Commissioner meant by a further word. He did not ask what we had discussed on the floor. He did not, in fact, say anything at all, which was the single most articulate thing he did all evening. I looked at him. He looked at his glass. The orchestra began something in 3/4 time, and I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives about one beat too late to be useful, that I had not been invited to a festive board. I had been delivered to it.
The dance has ended. The commission has been given quietly under cover of an orchestra. and the silence beside Miss West at the supper table is doing rather more work than any of the music. We return for the drive home to Bloomsbury.
I drove her home myself, which I had intended, before the evening began, as a kindness. It did not feel like one by the time we reached Great Russell Street.
You knew.
I knew he intended to ask something of you. I was not told what.
That is a very careful answer, Flynn.
It is a true one.
It is both. I have found those are not always the same virtue. I watched the street lamps slide across his profile, one after another, and thought about how a man can be entirely honest and still manage to tell you nothing whatever. Did you invite me tonight because you wished my company, or because the commissioner required a woman he could ask a favour of, and it was easier to produce one who already trusted you?
Both things can be true, Maud.
How convenient for you that they so often are. He did not answer that. I let the silence sit for the length of 2 streets, which is, I find, exactly long enough to make a man uncomfortable without giving him the satisfaction of a further question to dodge.
I did not lie to you tonight.
No. You simply arranged matters so that you should never have to. We had arrived. He did not get out to open my door, which was, for once, the correct instinct. I should have found the courtesy unbearable just then. I let myself out. Good night, Flynn.
Maud.
Not tonight. I did not look back to see what he did with the rest of the sentence. I have since wondered. I have not asked.
I had chosen the room deliberately. Not my office. Too many ears attached to too many doors. A private room above a chop house in Villiers Street, rented under a name that was not mine, is a poor substitute for discretion. But it is what London affords a commissioner who suspects his own CID. Miss West arrived punctually. Flynn arrived 2 minutes after her, and considerably less at ease. Thank you both for coming. I shan't waste your evening with more ceremony than the matter deserves. Some 18 months ago, a French lady of considerable means, I shall call her the Comtesse de Vaillant, though that is not her name, began receiving racing tips from a publication called the Continental Turf Gazette. Infallible tips, she was assured, from a man of remarkable judgment. She was encouraged to place her own wages through a bank, the Britannia and Colonial, that does not, in point of fact, exist.
The oldest trick in the book, and still the most reliably effective. What did it cost her?
The first sum was modest, the second was not. When she grew suspicious, she was informed that under English law she must forward a further sum or forfeit the first. Her solicitor recognized the shape of the fraud and came to us directly.
And the difficulty is not the fraud itself.
The difficulty, Inspector, is that every warrant we have attempted to raise against the men running it has been anticipated. Addresses cleared the day before we called. A witness who changed his account overnight. I have come to the unhappy conclusion that someone within my own criminal investigation department is being paid to see that this case goes precisely nowhere.
I confess my irritation with the manner of the evening's beginning receded somewhat, hearing that. A fraud is a fraud. A fraud protected from within is a different and rather more serious animal. You want someone who can go where your own men cannot, close enough to see who is being paid, without ever being taken for the yard.
Precisely. Inspector Flynn will be your sole contact. He reports to me and to no one else on this matter. Whatever you find, it comes to me through him and through no other channel.
How reassuring to learn I am to conduct an investigation into corrupted lines of communication. Using a line of communication, I am given no choice but to trust absolutely.
I appreciate the irony, Miss West. I have not been able to devise a version of this arrangement without it.
He looked for the first time that evening, genuinely tired.
I do not ask this lightly. 4 good men's careers may end over what you find. Possibly mine, if it is shown I sat on it too long. I would rather know the truth and pay that price than continue pretending my own house is in better order than it is.
I believed him. That did not mean I had entirely forgiven the waltz.
The case is set. The commissioner has laid his cards on the table above a chop house that will never know how much history passed through its upstairs room. Now, a new name, a new face, and an old trick that has caught wiser women than a French comtesse. We return for the making of Mrs. Iris Marsh.
Iris Marsh was assembled with the same care I give any disguise, and rather more sorrow than most, because widowhood is not a costume one enjoys wearing even for professional purposes. A rubber planter's wife, husband dead of fever in Malaya some 18 months prior, newly arrived in London with a modest fortune and no family to trouble themselves over how she managed it.
You'll want for an introduction. They don't take strangers who simply appear.
No. They want strangers who are brought to them, complaining prettily of having no one to advise her on her investments. Leave that part to me, Flynn. It is the part I am good at. It took 3 weeks, and one very tedious luncheon, with a woman I cared for not at all before the introduction arrived precisely as I had engineered it. Sideways, through gossip. Exactly the way such men prefer their marks to arrive, believing themselves undiscovered rather than delivered. Mr. Ambrose Rourke was, I will grant him, an excellent performer. Warm, unhurried, the sort of man who asks after your late husband with just enough tenderness to seem sincere and just enough brevity to seem tactful. He told me, over tea, of a certain tip sheet he had the good fortune to advise on, and a gentleman of remarkable judgment it served, and how a woman of means and discretion might find her fortune considerably improved by a modest association with it. You are very persuasive, Mr. Rourke. I confess I know almost nothing of racing. He assured me this was no obstacle whatever, and rather an advantage, since the gentleman's method required no expertise beyond a willingness to trust him. I have rarely enjoyed pretending to be foolish so much as I did that afternoon. It is, I find, the most convincing disguise a clever woman can wear, because no one ever suspects it of being one. The tip sheet and the phantom bank got me the outward shape of the thing within a fortnight. Checks on an institution that exists nowhere but Threadneedle Street stationery. Sums escalating with each supposed success. It got me nothing of the men behind it, nor any name worth carrying to Flynn. Marks are not shown ledgers, marks are shown returns. So I stopped being merely profitable and became useful. My late husband kept accounts through Rangoon and Penang that never once troubled a London bank's curiosity, Mr. Rourke. If your associates find London channels inconvenient, I may be able to offer something rather more valuable than my own small capital. I watched him decide, in the space of a breath, that I was worth bringing closer, rather than merely fleecing at a comfortable distance. It is a particular look men get, calculating the difference between a woman worth robbing and a woman worth recruiting. I have learned to enjoy producing it. Within the week, I was shown the counting room.
She was punctual, as always, and gave me nothing beyond the case, which was, I supposed, exactly what I deserved.
The tip sheet calls itself the Continental Turf Gazette. Worthless, of course. The bank behind it exists nowhere but a printer's block on Threadneedle Street stationery.
Names?
None yet. A Mr. Rourke does the talking. There will be others behind him who do the arithmetic.
Be careful going further in.
I am always careful, Flynn.
You are always confident. It is not, in my experience, quite the same thing. She did not honour that with a reply. She rose, straightened her gloves, and left me on the bench to consider how much colder she could make an ordinary sentence sound than most people manage with a shout.
We met this time among the second-hand shelves of a bookshop off Cecil Court, which Flynn had chosen for reasons he did not explain, and I did not ask after, though I suspected he simply liked the quiet of it. I have one further thing for you, and a question that has nothing whatever to do with the case.
The case first, if you don't mind.
I gave him the case first. A third man, unnamed as yet, who moves the ring's money out of the country once Rourke and Voss have finished collecting it. A description, nothing more solid.
Good. That's something to work with.
Now, the other matter. Why is it, Flynn, that you say nothing at precisely the moments a person most wants you to say something?
I don't know that I follow.
You follow perfectly well. The dinner, the dance, Grantham's little remark about a further word. You had an entire sentence available to you, and you spent it on your soup.
There are things I am not permitted to discuss, Maud.
That is a reason, Flynn. It is not an answer.
The man you mentioned, can you get closer to him without Rourke noticing?
I let him have the subject change. I did not, however, forget the question, and I rather think he knew that better than he let on. Mr. Voss. The ring's quiet one. The counter of money rather than the teller of tales. Asked me to wait while he found the papers on a Rotterdam transfer. A formality, he said, before any new capital of mine could be routed through the existing arrangements. I had been waiting 11 minutes. I had used 4 of them productively. The ledger sat on the desk, exactly where a confident man leaves such things, closed but not locked, in a room he did not imagine held any interest for a widow from Malaya beyond the figures concerning her own money. The entries were coded, but a code built by men in a hurry is rarely built well. Payments, dates, initials in place of names. Our friend at the yard, doing a great deal of work for 4 words. And then, at the foot of a page, some months old, a note in a hand that was not Voss's careful copying. A hand I had seen before, on warrant forms, on the margin of a report Flynn once left on my desk by mistake, on a dozen pieces of paper that had crossed between the yard and myself over 3 years of cases. I did not recognise the name beside it. I recognised the hand. Oh, you have been careless, haven't you? I closed the ledger, not quickly. Quickly is what a guilty woman does. And Iris Marsh had no reason to be guilty of anything but curiosity, which I permitted myself, mildly, arranging my gloves as though I had simply been admiring the room. Mr. Voss returned with his papers and his placid, unbothered face, and I understood, watching him, that he had no notion what I had read. That was very nearly worse than if he had.
She was already there when I arrived and had not touched her drink, which told me a good deal before she said a word.
I want you to look at something. Not read it. Look at it.
She slid across a scrap of paper, a careful copy in her own hand of a single line she had not dared linger over long enough to steal outright. Where did you see this?
In a ledger, in a back room, in a building I am not meant to admit I was in. Flynn. Whose hand is that?
I knew that hand. The closed loop on the G, the flattened cross on the T. I had seen it on 100 requisition forms, in the margins of case files, on a birthday card left in the mess the previous winter that everyone had signed. Not a stranger's hand, not even a distant colleague's. Chief Inspector Price. Saying it at ordinary volume felt like an accusation the room was not built to hold.
You're certain?
I have sat across a desk from that hand for 6 years. I am certain.
You've worked with him?
I've worked for him, twice, on secondment. He taught me how to run a surveillance rotation without burning through a full division.
Flynn.
Don't. Not yet. I need a moment before I have to be a policeman about it.
I gave him the moment, which is not generally a thing I am good at. When he spoke again, his voice had gone flat and procedural, the register he uses when holding something down by main force.
I'll take it to the Commissioner myself, not through the usual channel, and you stop going back tonight, whatever excuse you like.
That isn't your decision, Flynn.
No, it's Price's. He's the one who decides how carefully anyone's been counting his ledgers. I don't like how good he is at his job.
We will pause there a moment. If you are listening to Micropulse, we would very much like to know where you are and what hour it is, wherever in the world you happen to be tuning in tonight. Leave it in the comments, your corner of things. Every note helps this community along, and we read every one. Now, back to the case.
I told him plainly because there is no way to tell a commissioner a thing like that gently, and I did not attempt one. Price, sir. He set down his pen very carefully, the way a man sets down something he would rather have thrown.
You are certain?
The hand is his. Miss West found it in the ring's own ledger, in a room she had no business being in and every reason to be in.
I trained under Price, Inspector. Did you know that? Before your time. He was one of the finest detective minds this branch has produced in 20 years.
Yes, sir.
That is not sympathy, Inspector, in case you mistake it for such. It is simply the shape of the disappointment. One does not grieve strangers so precisely. I asked Flynn what he required to make the arrest sound rather than merely suspected, and he told me, without embellishment, that Miss West would need one further visit to confirm the ledger's full extent, dates, sums, the complete run of the coded correspondence, before any warrant would survive a barrister's cross-examination. I did not like it. I said so. Then get her out sooner, Inspector, not later. I would rather try Price on thinner evidence than read Miss West's name in a coroner's report.
I've told her to stop.
Have you? And has she agreed? Flynn did not answer that, which I took correctly as its own answer.
Flynn had told me to stop. I had every intention of stopping, directly after one further visit, because the ledger's later pages, the ones that would actually hang a man, rather than merely embarrass him, were dated within the fortnight, and a case built on everything but the most damning entries is not a case Flynn's superiors could safely bring to trial. I told myself this was professionalism. I am aware, in hindsight, that it was also the particular stubbornness that has landed me in difficulty on more than one prior occasion, and that Flynn, had I asked him, would have said exactly that, in exactly that tone. I did not ask him. Mr. Voss was not at his desk when I arrived, which should have told me a great deal more than it did. I had the ledger open to the correct page within 90 seconds. I had grown proficient. when I heard Mr. Rourke's voice in the corridor, considerably less warm than I had heretofore known it. He was asking, of someone I could not see, whether the widow Marsh had been shown the Rangoon correspondence, and whether anyone had thought to write to the shipping line to confirm a dead planter had ever existed at all. I closed the ledger. I did not have 90 seconds this time. I was through the side door and into the street before Mr. Voss returned to find his counting room disturbed and his widow gone, and I did not trouble myself over which of those facts he found more alarming. I had perhaps 30 yards on them when the shouting began behind me. I ran the way one runs when running is the entire remaining plan, without grace, without dignity, with my heart doing considerably more work than my legs. The alley let out onto the embankment, and I had a brief, foolish moment of relief at the open air before I understood that open ground favoured them and not me. There were two of them. The one in the tweed cap was faster than his build suggested he ought to be. I did not hear the third man until his hand was already on my shoulder. The parapet caught me at the hip rather than the knee, which is, I am told since, the difference between falling and going over. I went over. The Thames in December does not feel like water. It feels like an argument the body loses immediately and completely.
I had been 40 yards behind her, closer than I had told the Commissioner I intended to be, because I had not liked the feel of the last 2 evenings and had stopped pretending my instructions to her were instructions I meant to follow myself. I did not think about the coat. I did not think about the cold. I did not, in point of fact, think at all, which is not a state I generally permit myself, and which I would recommend to no one, and which I do not regret. I found her by the pale of her sleeve against the black water. I do not know how. I am not able afterward to describe the method. I simply did.
We came out some way downriver, at a set of stone steps neither of us had chosen. Both of us, having stopped choosing anything several minutes prior in favour of simply not drowning. I sat where I landed. He sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, both of us too spent for the usual scrupulous correctness. Flynn, I'm sorry.
Don't be. Just don't make me.
He did not finish it. He had said it once before, at a table, dry and half a joke, warning me off a docker's hook and my own poor judgment. It had been easy to say then, because it had been hypothetical. It was no longer hypothetical. He had just fished me, quite literally, out of the actual river, and the old line would not come out of him twice in the same voice. I finished it for him. Quietly, not as a jab. Look for me in a river. I remember. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had none of its usual careful economy.
Grantham swore me to it. Before the Festive Board. Before you'd even been asked. He said if I gave you so much as a look of warning, you'd read the whole shape of it in an instant, and he wanted the ask to come from him directly, without you already halfway to a decision. I hated it. I sat at that table and hated every second of it. And I still didn't tell you because he was my commissioner and you were...
Say it, Flynn.
You were the one person in that room I could not stand to have think badly of me. And I let you think it anyway, because I judged that safer than the alternative. I have had a great deal of time in that river to reconsider the judgment. I have never been a man who says the necessary thing at the necessary moment. I have watched Maud do it over and over across 1 year of cases with an ease I have envied more than I have ever admitted. I did not manage it gracefully even now, soaked to the skin on a set of steps neither of us had chosen. I would rather go into that river after you every week for the rest of my career than spend one more evening not telling you why I said nothing at that dinner. I am aware that is not a declaration a sensible woman would find romantic.
You would be surprised what a woman finds romantic, Flynn, once she has stopped expecting sonnets from a man who thinks in occurrence book entries.
Is that a yes to something, Maud, or merely an observation?
It is both. I have found those are not always the same virtue, but on this occasion I believe they may be. He was the one who moved first. He stood and held out his hand to help me up, in the manner of a man performing an entirely ordinary courtesy. He continued to hold it a moment or two past what the courtesy strictly required. Neither of us remarked upon it. The fog sat low over the water, and somewhere upstream a boat's bell rang once and was not answered, and I found I did not, for once, feel any particular urgency to point out the omission.
The river has given back what it took, and rather more besides. There remains a ledger, a warrant, and a chief inspector who does not yet know his hand has been read by a woman he believes he never met. We return for the reckoning.
The ledger, the coded correspondence, and a sworn account from Miss West of Threadneedle Street, who does not exist, and never did, were sufficient in the end for Sir Aldous to move. Chief Inspector Price was arrested at his own desk on a Tuesday morning, with a courtesy I confess I found difficult to extend him myself, and did not attempt to.
He asked for his coat before they took him out. Grantham let him have it.
Small mercies, Flynn.
I'm not certain they're deserved. I gave them anyway. The matter of Chief Inspector Carrow, whose name appeared twice in the ledger's coded correspondence, and whose defence rested entirely on the assertion that a man may be discussed without being complicit, was rather less clean. He was tried, he was acquitted, on evidence that convinced a jury without convincing anyone who had actually read the ledger. He resigned his post within the month, regardless, which the Commissioner privately allowed, was very nearly the same thing as a verdict, delivered by a slower and quieter court.
I would have preferred a conviction, Miss West. I will settle for the resignation. It is not everything. It will have to do.
I have played a good many women who were not myself in the course of this work. A bride, a dark-room girl, a music-hall dancer, and now, however briefly, a widow from Malaya who never once existed, and whose grief I borrowed with rather more care than I expected to need. Iris Marsh is folded away now, in the files where I keep the others, and I do not imagine I shall take her out again. Flynn's silence at the Festive Board is a harder thing to fold away, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I have not wanted to. He told me why on a set of stone steps by the river, soaked through and further from compose than I have ever seen him. I believed him. I am aware that believing a man and forgiving him are not, strictly, the same transaction. But on this occasion, I find I have paid both accounts at once, and do not regret the expense. There is a chief inspector who will not sit behind a desk again, and another who has resigned his in a silence nearly as loud as a conviction, and a commissioner who thanked me with the particular gravity of a man who knows exactly what he asked of me, and is not entirely at peace with having asked it. And there is Flynn, who went into the Thames in December without pausing long enough to remove his coat, and who has since said considerably more to me on a riverbank than in 1 year of investigations and closed cases combined. I think I shall let him go on doing so, I have not yet decided how much I shall tell him that, in so many words. There is a category of certainty, I find, that is not meant to be announced. Only attended to, carefully and allowed to grow. The kettle came to the boil. I made the tea. Until the next inquiry, I remain Maud West, private inquirer.
You've been listening to the case files of Maud West. Tonight's episode, A Convenient Silence. If you are new to these stories, subscribe and join us next time when another truth waits to be brought to light by whoever is patient enough and honest enough to go looking for it.